Chapter 14. The night was quiet. A gentle breeze blew through the trees. The fire crackled as it ate away at the sticks buried in its heart. All around nothing living stirred. No animals broke twigs, no crickets chirped, and no night birds let loose their shrill cries. Only the breeze and the fire let Lyra know sound still existed. "It's so quiet," she remarked. "Well, it should be," Dis replied. "Why?" she asked. "Back home the woods were always filled with noise at night. Sometimes it was hard to sleep, even in your grove." "Oh," Dis looked up, surprise on his face. "Oh, yes." He slapped his forehead. "Did I forget to tell you where we are?" Lyra's face fell to confusion. "We're in the woods." "Ha!" Dis smiled, his foxy grin showing teeth. "We are in the woods, but we are also technically in purgatory." Lyra felt the hairs on her neck start to rise. Purgatory? A creeping sensation climbed from her bowels and settled in her stomach. Purgatory? She didn't remember dying, but she knew you couldn't reach the space in between any other way. How? When did we die? Dis let out a scoff. "Don't be silly. What is my domain?" Lyra responded, the answer drilled into her mind over the last several days. "Chaos, death, destruction." "Exactly," Dis replied. He started to poke at the fire, stirring the flames a bit. After a few minutes of this, it became clear to Lyra he thought his explanation had been enough. "That doesn't answer my question," she said. Dis sighed, starting to look like he was dealing with an annoying toddler that had just learned the question, why? "I am the ruler of the underworld. Souls destined for heaven depart right after death. Souls bound to hell drop there like a rock in a pool. Those too tainted to go to heaven, yet not necessarily corrupt enough for hell, get stuck here. Purgatory, as it happens, lies closer to hell than heaven, so I can simply step sideways and there I am. Remember the fog we passed through when we first started off on our adventure?" Lyra thought back to the night she left with Dis. She remembered clearly the feeling of elation at finally knowing who her father was. She remembered the excitement of doing something different, not being the maiden slave forced to care for the grove anymore. Faintly, buried beneath all the pleasure and excitement, she did remember a brief fog. "Yes, but it didn't seem really remarkable." "It wouldn't," Dis responded. "Purgatory is basically a shadow of the real world. Time and space distort a little sometimes, so traveling here can be faster than traveling through the normal world. You just have to have a bit of a different sense of direction. Only Gaia and I have access to this part of the world, though she prefers Cronus's little wormholes." He scrunched his face. "He won't really let me play with them. That explains why we haven't come across anyone else." Lyra remembered Dis had brought her the robe she was wearing that first night. "Where did my clothes come from?" She paused a moment. "For that matter, where have you been getting our food? You said you go hunting." "I took the clothes from some travelers in the normal world, and I hunt for you while you sleep." His gaze was drifting off to the woods. He seemed to be getting distracted. "You leave me here alone?" Lyra almost shouted at him. This drew Dis's gaze back. The steel had returned to his eyes. "This is my domain. Gaia may visit, but she has no sway here. Everything here does as I command, and they know what will happen if you are harmed." He slowed his words, emphasizing every syllable. "There is nowhere you can be safer." Despite her fears from childhood tales, Lyra felt herself relaxing again. He was telling the truth. He may push her hard to train, but so far the worst that had happened were some cuts and gashes, bruises and wounded pride. No matter how dangerous the situation seemed, she knew while her father was around nothing could hurt her. "I'm sorry I didn't trust you." Lyra looked down at her arm, rubbing the place where the bear had laid a deep wound. Despite his rule of not healing her within the day of her getting hurt in training, he had healed this one. Dis, his focus having drifted back to the woods, turned to her and smiled. "Don't worry. I forget you don't know what I know yet. It should startle anyone to be here that didn't know better." "He's coming again, isn't he?" Lyra asked quietly. "Who?" Dis asked, his attention fully on the woods. "That shade you talk to when I go to bed. He's coming to visit again, isn't he?" Lyra looked up at Dis. She didn't like the way her father became so distant when the creature visited. "Have I told you that you're very observant?" Dis asked. "Once or twice," Lyra replied, trying to fake a little indifference. "Why do you always talk to him away from me?" "Not everything I do is pleasant. I don't want to taint the time I'm spending with you before I have to. It has been nice getting to simply be a dad," Dis replied, his answer so honest it surprised Lyra. She had been expecting some sort of dance around the truth. with that jovial tone he always took when trying to downplay something serious. I know what you are, Father. She scooted closer to Dis. You don't have to hide from me. Dis looked down at her, fully in the moment. He placed his arm around her shoulder and pulled her closer. I know, dear. I also forget you aren't really a child anymore. I've simply seen you as one too many times to move past it. His tone somber, he asked, Would you like to start taking part in my planning? Lyra felt a trill of excitement pass through her. Yes. Pride swelled in Dis's smile. Then let's go meet my messenger. Dis stood up, offering Lyra his hand to help her to her feet. Together they set off towards the woods at the edge of the fire. She noticed now that he made no sound when he walked. No twigs broke, no leaves cracked. It was as if he were weightless and simply gliding over the ground. As soon as they left the ring of light the fire produced, blackness enveloped them. Lyra thought this darkness was deeper than what a person buried alive might find. Almost instinctively, she switched on her powers. Immediately, everything became clear. She could see every detail of the forest around her, every leaf and twig. She had gone from absolute darkness to a clarity that could rival a noonday sun. She also started feeling that familiar tug, a small voice at the back of her mind telling her to draw deeper, that she could do so much more. She pushed it aside and focused on following Dis. They didn't travel long before Dis held up his hand for her to stop. A small sliver appeared in the air, and from it a mist seeped. Slowly it rose and thickened, taking on an almost human quality. I have a report, Master, the shade declared in its wispy voice. Proceed, Dis commanded, all friendliness gone from his voice, his features lacking any sign of emotion. Lyra had only seen this version of her father briefly before. It was disconcerting. Everything about him suggested he couldn't feel anything but anger. The shade hesitated. But the girl. We've gone through this before. Dis raised his hand, and for the first time Lyra saw Dis manifest his powers. Black lines crawled up his forearm, clawing a path across his skin like scratches from a thorn bush. They slithered and swarmed, moving until they reached his fingertips where they moved out into the air. Your place is not to question me. The lines raced to the shade and wrapped around it. They seemed to stretch the creature, pulling the fog of its essence in every direction. Yes, Master, it screeched, clearly in pain. Please forgive me. Dis snapped his fingers closed into a fist. The black lines disappeared from the air immediately, but were still present on his arm and hand. They writhed like creatures trying to escape, struggling to once more envelop their prey. Report, Dis commanded once more. They did as you thought they might. The other gods have made no move that I can tell, but Felvar and Gaia's Gifted, along with the Time Warden and a Smith's apprentice, are headed towards Drakenfell. The shade paused. His report had been quick, echoes of the pain he had received quaking in his voice. Where are they now? Approaching the Nachtwald. Dis's gaze shifted to the sky. It was hard to tell, but Lyra decided he was mulling over this information. Are you going to have them killed? She asked. Maybe. Why do you ask? He looked down at his child. That cold gaze being directed at her made her shiver. Suddenly she had more respect for the shade. It must have taken significant bravery to do anything other than give the report with those eyes locked on it. Unless I'm wildly wrong, the four you referred to are Roland, Cyrus, Sarah, and Severin. Am I correct? She directed her question at the shade. It hesitantly looked toward Dis. Go ahead. I believe those are the names they use, it said. Do they matter to you? Dis asked. Not particularly. At least not Roland, Cyrus, nor Sarah. They were some of the few in the village that were nice to me. Roland at least seemed to try to be friendly. But they were still part of them, part of the village, Lyra said. Severin, though, treated me well. He was the only person that seemed to care about me out of more than pity. While those sound like good enough reasons to not outright kill them, they were being set on a path by my enemies. Dis spoke as if he were reasoning with himself. Their treatment of you would earn them leniency from a direct encounter. However, I do not know what Gaia and Felvar have planned. Can I afford pity for my enemy's tools? Lyra was starting to learn why Dis had tried not to involve her. His logic was cold, but true. They had been nice enough to her. She didn't wish them any harm, but if he ordered the shade to have them killed, she wouldn't resent her father at all for it. Though she might try to have him at least spare Severin, she resolved to follow his lead for the rest. Dis looked at Lyra. He studied her face. On it he saw the internal struggle she was feeling. He saw the tearing of her feelings cross over her eyes. He knew she would do anything he asked of her, nor begrudge him killing the closest things she had had to friends. His observations cracked a tiny part of the still facade he had put on. This time I will be lenient. Don't deal with them directly, but there are things left over from the time of Orcus in that area, correct? Not many, Master, the Shade replied, fully recovered from before. There are a few less desirable creatures left there, though. Then we will give the group at least a fighting chance. Alert these creatures of potential prey passing through the woods. Tell them the woods are their territory now, and they should prevent any humans from passing through, starting with these. However, don't tell them these humans are gifted. If the creatures kill them, they weren't worthy of our attention to begin with. If, however, they manage to survive, we'll know they pose a significant threat and will address them properly the next time. Lyra let out the breath she didn't realize she had been holding. He wasn't ordering them killed, and for some reason that brought her some relief. Yes, Master. The Shade bowed deeper. Is there anything else you wish for me to do? Yes, Dis replied. No matter the outcome, make sure the creatures perish once the group has been dealt with, one way or another. I have a feeling I know which ones have survived, and I don't want them. Yes, my lord, the Shade replied, starting to slip back into the shadows. Oh, and Friedishor. I may have some use for him, Dis threw in, almost as an afterthought. This gave the Shade pause. It seemed almost ready to question Dis again. The Shade looked up at Dis and seemed to decide against it. Yes, Master. Quickly it fled before it could be given another order it didn't wish to obey. Dis turned and started walking back towards their camp. Lyra followed closely behind. Her mind was racing, trying to process everything. Nothing much had happened, but she was facing the realization that at some point people were going to die, and she was probably going to have to be part of it. Just before they crossed back into the light of the fire, she let her powers fade. The two of them sat, still next to each other, but a small distance having formed between them. Don't think on this too much, Lyra. Dis's voice had gained back its feeling. It was tempered now, but he was her father once more. We're starting a war. In war, people die, and they won't always be people you hate. In fact, very rarely will you feel much one way or the other about them. They were the opponent, that's it. He sighed and put his arm around her shoulders again. This is the unpleasant side of battle, facing the foes you don't want to face. They will probably end up dying before this is over. Do you know whose fault that is? He turned and looked at Lyra. She looked her father in the eyes and shook her head. Gaia and Felvar. They are responsible for pulling them into this. Take the sadness you feel that these particular people might die and focus it on them. Turn the sadness to hate. Use the hate to stoke rage. Passion and intensity reigned in his voice and gaze. They are the cause of all this, every last bit. Focus on them. We will have our revenge for wrongs past, present, and future. Lyra's face set with resolve. She gave her father a nod. She would do as he said. Focus on the true enemy, the ones that had caused the pain here. She would help him see Gaia and Felvar dead. Good. A wicked grin spread across his face. We are almost to Alexandria. Once there, I can prepare a small surprise for our friends. But which one should I send it to? Chapter 15. So we're going in there, Sarah said. It seems so, Roland replied. There isn't a way around? Cyrus asked. I don't know, Roland replied. How long has Severin been gone? Sarah asked, nervousness slipping into her voice. At the moment, they were in a nice clearing, sunshine gently warming their shoulders, a breeze blowing in from the mountains. The land spread out in rolling foothills to their left and right. No suggestion of malice, no fearsome shadows to be found. Dead ahead, though, the road was swallowed. 100 yards in front of them, as far as they could see to the left and right, the thickest forest any of them had ever come across captured their vision. The road was clearly the path in, but the trees seemed to bend over it as if they were trying to hide it, to make it a part of the forest. The entrance into the forest was a doorway of shadows, the light they currently bathed in only illuminating the first few feet beyond the tree line. They had arrived at the Nachtwald. Can't have been more than a few minutes, Roland said. He's only scouting the entrance. He shouldn't be much longer. He twitched in his saddle. His words sounded more like he was trying to reassure himself than speaking the truth. He'll be fine, Cyrus interjected, far more confident than Roland seemed. I, for one, am starting to wonder why we were getting so worked up over a simple forest. You're just as nervous as the rest of us, Cyrus, Sarah snapped. I didn't say I wasn't, Cyrus snapped back. All I'm saying is they're just trees. Why are we letting ourselves get so worked up? It can't be that bad in there. I don't know, Roland said. It wasn't that long ago that I was convinced the tree in the grove just grew in a weird way. This seemed to give Cyrus pause. Please don't do that. What? Roland asked, turning to face Cyrus. Make valid points when I'm trying to make myself feel better, Cyrus said. Oh, sorry. Roland turned back to face the woods again. He knew what Cyrus had said should be true, but there was something about the way the forest swallowed the road. It made the whole place take on an eerie air. His mind told him it was just another forest, but his gut screamed at him to turn around and find another way. Before he could think too long on his screaming stomach, he noticed a figure starting to emerge from the forest entrance. Well, I guess we are done waiting. The trio kicked their horses into motion to meet Severin. Roland started to focus on the sound of his horse's hooves as they clopped on the dirt, the gentle clip-clop helping distract him from the growing proximity of the forest. The rhythm lulled his mind away from the anxiety. How's it look? Sarah shouted to Severin. Like a dark, creepy forest, Severin responded, pulling up close to the trio. But for future reference, could you not shout at me when we're going into an unknown area? I'd like for us to have the element of surprise if there's anything waiting for us. Sarah flushed, clearly embarrassed to have let her nerves make her shout so loudly. Sorry. It doesn't matter. Right now nothing is stirring inside, Severin said, suspicion lacing his voice. Well, don't try to sound too disappointed, Cyrus quipped. There should be something moving around. Can you sense anything, Sarah? Severin turned to the girl. I haven't checked, Sarah replied, then paused, cocking her head at the old man. She asked, How did you know I can sense life? Why wouldn't I know, since you're one of Gaia's scions, he replied. Sarah decided not to argue with him and just do as he had asked her. She cleared her thoughts, then opened her mind to the world around her. She could sense life in every direction, thousands of tiny creatures in the dirt, then a few bigger ones scattered in the fields around them. Nothing ahead, though. There's nothing, she said with awe. Nothing at all in there. There's life all around us, everywhere except straight ahead. It's like the world just ends. Roland didn't think Severin's face could become more serious than it already was, but he was wrong. He almost thought he saw the old warrior pale a little. I didn't see anything, but there is something off. Keep close. We're going to try and move through it quickly. It doesn't stretch on for long, but it will take the rest of the day to clear to the other side. I don't want to be stuck in it after nightfall. Severin turned his horse and heeled it forward. Quickly, the group kicked their own mounts into motion, matching Severin's pace but letting him keep the lead. Whether knowingly or by accident, they were riding in a tight formation, each being able to reach out and touch at least one of the others. The entrance to the forest loomed over the road. The trees seemed to be growing bigger than they should. They had only been waiting 100 yards off. That shouldn't have diminished their height this much. Roland, Cyrus, and Sarah all grew tense, muscles tightening, breath coming in much more deliberately, much more slowly, but as quietly as possible. Each heartbeat echoed in their ears, each pulse sounding like a river stream rushing past. Step by slow and gentle step, they grew closer, until finally they were at the tree line. This is it, thought Cyrus to himself. We will cross into the trees and see that it's just a forest. Everyone will let out a good deep breath, and we will all relax and enjoy a good ride through the woods. Then, right after his horse crossed well and truly into the woods, the sensation of being watched started. Their horses plodded on, each rider's grip on their reins so tense their knuckles were white. Silence. The hoofbeats were muted, no birds chirped, no insects buzzed. Silence. So little sunlight made it through the canopy that they could only see a few feet at a time. Silence. No breeze blew below the trees, no slight breath to move the dank air, yet somehow the oppressive smell of rotting leaves permeated the air. Despite the time of year, the forest acted like a sauna. Humidity pressed in on all sides. Beads of sweat ran down each rider's face, stinging their eyes as they tried to keep the vigil. They didn't dare let go of the reins to wipe it away, though, in case they needed to kick into a gallop on short notice. Even getting a drink from a water skin was too risky. But on top of it all, on top of the heat, the tension, the thirst, only one thing reigned: silence. Cyrus decided he had had enough. Everything about this ran against his personality. He liked to make jokes, to lay around, to laugh off the strain of situations like this. They had been riding for hours and nothing had happened. The forest was creepy enough without them helping it out by acting like they were under siege. "Could you pass me?" "Quiet," Severin hissed. Cyrus ignored him. "Some water, please?" he asked Sarah, shooting a scowl at Severin. Sarah hesitated, looking between Cyrus and Severin, unsure if it was okay to do anything at the moment. Severin was clearly angry. She didn't want that anger directed at her. However, every moment she hesitated, she could see Cyrus getting angry as well. Before the tension could build too much, Severin waved her on. Breathing out a sigh of relief, she unclipped the skin from her saddle and passed it to Cyrus. "Thank you," he said in a clear, easily heard voice. Severin drew his horse to a halt, almost causing a collision with the three riding behind him. He jerked the skin from Cyrus's hands, grabbed the youth's throat, and pulled him close. "Listen, you foolish child. I'm not taking precautions because I enjoy making an ass of myself. Control yourself for once, damn it. If you make another noise, I'll unhorse you and we'll leave you behind to walk out. You won't endanger us because you can't see that you, yourself, are in a dangerous situation." He pushed the skin into Cyrus's chest, turned his horse, and started leading the way again. With shaky hands and a pale face, Cyrus had his drink. Maybe, he thought, I should stay quiet. Another hour passed, another hour of heat, thirst, and silence. They were all getting exhausted. Being at high alert for hours on end had pushed them further than even the hardest evening of training could have prepared them for. Roland was fighting the urge to nod off in the saddle. Sarah was gripped so hard by her nerves, cramps were racking her legs. Cyrus simply wanted to scream. Severin, though, pressed on. Central to his mind was getting the children to safety. Finally, far off in the distance, a faint light could be seen. Every few paces it seemed to grow bigger, as if they were approaching the end of a tunnel. Finally, Roland sighed, then stiffened and prepared himself for Severin. To everyone's surprise, he simply agreed. "Yes," he whispered, "but don't let your guards down yet." No sooner had the words left his mouth than a loud crack sounded off in the distance. Severin's hand shot up in the air, calling a halt. Everyone held their breath and listened. Sarah watched Severin, watched for any sign he had heard anything else. All she could hear was the rapidly increasing heartbeat pulsing through her ears. She could feel herself on the verge of panicking. Every fiber of her being wanted her to jerk her horse's reins, kick its flank, and ride as fast as she could towards the exit. She closed her eyes, then slowly let out the breath she had been holding. As quietly as she could, she focused on slowing her heartbeat. In, hold, out. In, hold, out. Bit by bit, her heart slowed down, her hearing cleared, and she felt her nerves calm down. Listening now, she couldn't hear anything. She decided to test her new sense and see if she could pick up anything the others might not. When she opened her mind, she felt her heart freeze. "Severin," her voice trembled. "Stay quiet," he hissed. "Severin, please," she whispered. "There's nothing out there." Severin turned to look at Sarah. The fear, the tremble of her voice made him ask, "Exactly what do you mean?" "I don't know," she said. "There isn't life, but there are holes, dozens of holes, places where nothing exists, and they are moving." "Gallop, now!" Severin shouted, jerking his horse into motion. As their mounts took off to follow the lead horse, each of the youths had to struggle to stay seated. Roland, being the quickest to regain his balance, reached out and helped Sarah settle herself in the saddle. "What's going on?" he shouted up to Severin. "There are many creatures that are the opposite of alive," he shouted back. "All of them belong to Dis." That was enough of an explanation for him. Roland crouched down and gave his horse its head, letting it go into a full-on sprint. He checked. Sarah and Cyrus had followed his lead and were doing the same with their horses. He turned his head to face Cyrus. "Could you pass the water?" Cyrus shouted at Roland, a smile on his face. Roland smiled back, thankful for something to smile about. As he started to respond, Cyrus was swept from his saddle, and then his horse disappeared as well. It happened so fast, Roland barely had time to register what had happened. It looked like the tree branches had struck both rider and horse, separately. "Cyrus!" he shouted, starting to rein in his horse. Severin was beside him immediately, encouraging Roland's horse back to full speed. "Keep going. You two wait outside. I'll go back for Cyrus." As soon as he was finished, he violently reined in his horse, turned, and disappeared into the shadows behind them. Roland's mind was reeling. One moment everything was fine, then the next Cyrus and his horse were taken down by a stray tree limb. He looked over at Sarah, and even in the gloom of the forest he could see tears trailing down her face. "They'll be okay," he shouted to her. She smiled back at him, a tight, forced smile. "I'm watching them." He still didn't fully understand Sarah's abilities, but he assumed she meant she was sensing Cyrus and Severin. Is Cyrus hurt?" he asked. "I can't tell," she replied. "I'm having a hard time homing in on them while we move. I'm sorry." "You can tell they're alive, though, right?" he asked. "Yes," she replied firmly, answering both the question asked and the one left unsaid. Roland turned his face forward again, watching the door of light grow larger and larger. They couldn't have more than a few hundred yards to travel. So close to the end, and everything had turned all at once. "We're almost there." He looked over to check on Sarah again. Her horse was still beside him, but Sarah was gone. He grabbed her horse's reins and brought both it and his own horse to a halt. Turning them around immediately, he started heading back towards the way they had come. She couldn't be that far behind him. "Sarah," he shouted, hoping that whatever had happened, she was still conscious and could reply. After a few feet, he slowed both horses to a canter. "Sarah," he shouted again, desperation running deep. "Sarah!" He jumped off his horse and pulled one of their pre-made torches from the saddle. Quickly he lit it using the flint from his pocket. The scene he illuminated seemed to come from a nightmare. While the road looked like any other, if not a little creepy, a few feet overhead and off the sides of the road, spider webs were spread everywhere. The plants seemed designed for fighting. Covered in thorns, their flowers looked like horned insects' heads instead of the soft, friendly petals of the flowers he knew. It was like looking into some sort of cave turned garden. "Sarah," he shouted again, fear and anger pulsing through his veins. Fear from not knowing what had happened, and anger at himself for losing her. She had been like a little sister to him for as long as he could remember. He wouldn't be able to live with himself if she were hurt. "Sarah!" He stopped and listened carefully after his last shout. There, off the road to his right, he thought he heard a muffled shout. He started running to the side of the road. He shouted her name again. Again, he heard the muffled response. Certain something was wrong beyond a fall from the saddle, he swapped the torch to his offhand and unsheathed the sword. Once he got to the edge of the road, he noticed something peculiar. While the brush from his waist up seemed undisturbed, there seemed to be a small tunnel from his waist down open. Rather than give up either the torch or his sword, he decided to try and hack a path into the forest. He followed the tunnel, though the going was slow. Every few feet he would shout and listen for the muffled response. Something was wrong. The responses seemed to be getting further away, quieter instead of louder, but always in the same direction. He decided he wasn't moving fast enough as he was, so reluctantly he sheathed his sword and tried crawling through the tunnel. This helped significantly. Whatever was clearing the path ahead of him was doing a good job. "Sarah." He paused and jumped when the response came almost immediately to his right. He leapt to his feet and started pushing as fast as he could through the brush. There he found her. She seemed to be fine, but someone had tied her hands and ankles with some kind of white cord. A strip of it was even looped around her mouth. He ran to her side and started trying to remove the bit from around her mouth. The stuff was sticky, like sap from a maple tree. He decided he needed both hands free to remove the gag, so he used a natural bend in a tree branch to hang his torch. As he placed it, the torch lit a small bit of stray web. The web burned quickly. He took note of this, glad he hadn't accidentally set fire to the forest in his haste to find Sarah. As he started working at the gag, he noticed how wide her eyes were. She seemed to be trying to talk to him. "Calm down and hold still. It's hard to get this stuff off as it is." She started shaking her head at him. "Come on, Sarah, stay still," he urged her. "The lady once says," a deep but shrill and feminine voice from behind Roland. "There is another here." Roland froze. His heart dropped and his stomach took off flying. "Determined, yes, yes." He felt something pressed down hard on his shoulder. "Rushes, foolhardy." Another something pressed on his other shoulder. He glanced to his right and saw that his shoulders were being gripped by what looked like 3 very long, clawed, and shelled fingers. Suddenly he was lifted off his feet and spun around. "This one is being haunted." The nightmare face that met him said, "It is in front of royalty." From the dark pit that was the thing's mouth, a gas hissed forth. In seconds, Roland was unconscious.